Today, we're talking tariffs because nothing says national security like a 145% price hike on garden hoses. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we untangle the fine print behind the biggest headlines in politics, hopefully without putting you to sleep. I'm Stephen, your legislative curiosity guide, and joining me as always is the policy powerhouse who makes Section 232 sound intriguing, Sarah.
You know, it's going to be a fun ride when tariffs are back in fashion.
Oh, tariffs are so hot right now. It's like the 1920s all over again. So today's episode is Tariff Turmoil. Congress responds to Trump's trade war revival.
Okay, so we all know there's trade war revival happening right now. We are well aware within the news cycle here in the States. But I would love to know what the news coverage is like over there across the pond, because one of the most interesting things when I lived in Spain was to see the difference between how things are covered in the U.S. when you're in it, and then as the global stage is looking at what the U.S. is doing and honestly scratching their head most of the time.
So in the UK, obviously, this is a major news story every day. Our economy is already faltering and has been, probably ever since 2008 when the US last wrecked the world economy. We, in common with a lot of countries around the world, never truly recovered from that one. And now here we are again. And so the big debate really is, should the UK be looking to the US in the future? And so we should therefore be in some way capitulating to Donald Trump and agreeing to the various sort of demands that he's making on us in terms of our economy? Or should we be instead aiming to try and forge closer links with the EU, which is, of course, quite hostile to Donald Trump? And then, of course, what about China? China is making overtures to all countries around the world, including the UK and the EU, saying, hey, this and what Trump's doing is terrible. Let's all join together and form these big free trade alliances and therefore grab a portion of the trade that the US currently dominates. So it's very, very difficult. And the Prime Minister is treading a very tough route because obviously we have this, what we like to think of as a special relationship with the US, and there's always very close ties between our Prime Minister and whoever the American president happens to be. So Starmer, our Prime Minister, is trying to maintain those relationships while at the same time trying to forge closer links with the EU and, of course, not be too negative towards the Chinese, because we do a lot of trade with China, as does the US and other countries. So it's very tough, and our politicians in particular struggle very hard to not be rude about the current situation in the US, because of course they're politicians. They're not allowed to be super rude to one of our sort of key allies. But at the same time, obviously, it's very, very difficult to defend what's going on and actually put it in any kind of positive light. So generally, it's what the F is happening, and can you please stop it?
Yes, the best worst thing about all of these tariffs is every week there's something announced. One of our allies is like, but wait a minute, I thought we were friends. And then Trump's like, well, friends slap friends in the face, don't they? And you're like, no, they actually don't. Like, why? Please stop. So...
Yeah. And the conversation, again, is a lot about chlorinated chicken. So chlorinated chicken is probably not something you've given an enormous amount of thought to. But here, it's almost a national obsession. The idea that if we do any kind of trade deal with the US, they'll force us to accept their chlorinated chicken. So chlorinated chicken is effectively chicken that's been treated with chlorine to kill bacteria. So it sounds like quite a good idea, actually, because you don't want rotten chicken. But the argument is, and the reason why it's not allowed in the UK or in the EU, in fact, is that it allows you to cover up meat that's starting to go off. And so therefore, you're actually using meat that isn't quite as fresh. And so it's sort of quite unpleasant. But the idea, of course, of dunking chicken in chlorine is quite unpleasant as well. So our trade representative saying, yes, we're willing to cut a deal with the US, but absolutely no on chlorinated chicken. We're not having the chlorinated chicken. Anything else is on the table, but not the chicken. Which is it's all quite surreal.
That is so funny, because one of the other stories that is really breaking through right now is how they're removing red dye number 3 from a lot of stuff in the US. But they're actually not removing it. There's no policy that went into removing it. It's just that RFK got people to agree that they would. There's no penalties for not doing it or anything like that. The red dye number 3 can dye the chlorinated chicken red, and then we can all start eating red chicken, and then we'll be fine. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's yes, it's all very strange, but it's terrible. I mean, underneath this, you've got a situation where the world could well be heading towards a massive recession, and it would be the first time in history that a recession will be caused by one individual. That a global recession will be caused almost deliberately by one individual. Because if you think about previous times when the world economy has taken a nosedive back in the 70s, or of course most famously in 2008, that wasn't deliberate. You know? Even the bankers that caused it, they weren't deliberately trying to cause that. It was an accident. Whereas this time, it's deliberate US policy.
This is something that Trump has been talking about for a while. And you would think that by the time he got the second chance to do this, and that there's more people who are really trying to drive policy behind Trump now, and especially with those Project 2025 people lingering about.
Yep.
But every time there's something happening with it, you're just, oh my God, this wasn't thought through. We just went there, we had Liberation Day, and now we're like, what the heck is happening? The stock market responding to tweets and all of these things and going like this, all because of tweets.
For me, what is really shocking about this is that there is no counter argument to it. When you see the very architects of this policy on television trying to defend it, they can't. Yep. Because nothing they say makes any sense. So they are reduced to an almost Animal Farm style denying of reality. And you've had lots of things saying, oh, inflation's coming down. It's fantastic. You know, price of eggs is coming down. Everything's really cheap in the US. Whereas people who live there know that's absolutely not true. Yeah. But if they say it often enough, they think that they can make people believe it. And maybe it's true. Who knows? We live in such a crazy world.
Truer words, Stephen. Truer words.
So let's start at the top. So Trump's back in the White House. He is rebooting his greatest hits. We've got tariffs. We've got the executive orders. We've got some very serious solo trade diplomacy. But before we get into what's actually happening now, let's just rewind for a second. So tariffs have been part of the US economic playbook forever, really. But how did we get to the point where the president can just throw down 145% tariff like it's no big deal?
That is the great question of the time right now. So there's been a slow power shift. Constitutionally, Congress does hold the purse strings and has the authority to regulate commerce, which originally included setting tariffs through legislation. But things changed in the 20th century, especially after the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And that law jacked up tariffs all across the board. Foreign countries hit back hard, and international trade basically fell off a cliff. Kind of what we're looking at right now. And it was just in time for the Great Depression.
Fabulous. Maybe having a paralyzed Congress like we do these days isn't such a bad idea.
Truly, truly, truly. And after that, Congress decided that maybe the executive branch could handle trade a little bit more flexibly. So in 1934, we got the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, followed by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. These laws gave the president more leeway to negotiate deals, impose tariffs, and respond to economic crises without having to wait on Congress every time, which you could imagine in our time of existence in our Congress now could be really problematic. But specifically, the 1962 Act's Section 232 allows a president to impose trade restrictions as part of a national security decision.
Hence why we now get tariff announcements via tweet instead of subcommittee hearings. So it's to keep us safe from, what, cheap stuff from abroad?
Exactly. And the original idea was to allow for quick responses to unfair trade practices or emergencies. But in recent years, especially under Trump, that authority has been stretched way beyond what most people expected. That is a very common theme of this administration. And during his first term, he used Section 232 to impose steel and aluminum tariffs, citing national security. Hit China with Section 301, which is part of the 1972 Act, which tackles unfair trading practices, and even threatened allies like Mexico and Canada.
So supporters called it tough love at the time, as I remember. Critics called it, understandably, chaos.
And now, in 2025, we are seeing Trade War 2, Electric Boogaloo, And Trump's rolling out sweeping tariffs again, particularly with China. In February, he hit them with a 10% tariff, then another 10% in March. In April, it skyrocketed to 125%, and then 145%, like you said. And that is not a tariff.
It's effectively an embargo. And of course, it's not just China that's been hit with these things. On Liberation Day, Trump famously imposed a quite bizarre range of tariffs on every country in the world, pretty much, only to be forced to roll them back days later as the US economy started to crater in a scarily serious way. But they've only been rolled back to 10% across the board, which does still make this current tariff regime, the one we're living in right now, the most punitive in more than 100 years. So we really are going back to the good old days of the 1920s.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I felt incredibly liberated on Liberation Day.
Absolutely. Liberated from billions and billions of dollars.
Yes. Yeah, the old 401k was lucky I'm still young. So the higher tariffs are only paused for 90 days, and they could be back. And it's kind of a let's talk, but I brought a bazooka to the table situation, which is, as people know, a very common way for Trump to negotiate and the art of the deal. As an aside, I do urge everyone to get on YouTube and watch the Democratic Penguins Republic trade war video, as the penguins of the Heard and McDonald Islands fight back. Truly one of the weirdest things you will ever see.
I am still having acid flashbacks. I haven't watched it. But it's not just a geopolitical problem, though. This is really hitting regular people.
Oh, yeah, big time. According to the Tax Foundation, the latest tariffs amount to an effective $1,300 tax increase per U.S. household for the year. That's groceries, clothing, electronics. And just think about this for a second. You might think that a Florida orange is U.S. grown, U.S. made. You're not going to have a tariff on it. But if you think about something for even 3 seconds and kind of go 2 steps down, what is the bag that the oranges are sold in? Where is that manufactured? How are the crates that the oranges are transported in created and purchased? And you kind of get into all these areas where, you know, a $5 bag of oranges is now $7 because everything else aside from just the orange that was grown in Florida is not made in the U.S. And the IMF also downgraded the U.S. growth forecast to 1.8%, blaming tariff drama and policy uncertainty. And the markets, the S&P 500, Dow, and NASDAQ have all been on a literal roller coaster. The investor confidence is spooked.
Absolutely. Wow. I just have to say that in Britain, we kill for a 1.8% growth forecast. We've been bobbling around 0% for like as long as I can remember. But anyway, that's aside. In the US, then, you've got higher prices, slower growth, market volatility, and that's before China's retaliation really fully kicks in. I mean, I have seen reports, quite perhaps slightly alarmist, saying that within 2 weeks, the shelves will start to go bare in America, and then we'll really see how the American consumer feels about not being able to buy the things they love.
Right, yeah. So China responded with 125% tariffs of their own against the U.S., and they've warned other countries to not sign trade deals that might weaken Beijing's leverage. So again, what you were talking about at the top, trying to figure out what these new relationships could look like in a world of Trump's trade war, Beijing is definitely trying to make sure that people are not allying against them.
Absolutely. And they've got a strong argument, haven't they? It's not Beijing that's been imposing tariffs and taking them off and imposing them again and threatening and all the other stuff that's been going on, really. And so President Trump has been using that good old Section 232 again, right?
Oh, yes. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 coming back for us. So Trump used it in 2018 for steel and aluminum, like we said. Now, in 2025, he's expanded the scope, launching new investigations into copper, to timber, to semiconductors, to pharmaceuticals. Basically, anything that moves and is vaguely industrial, it seems to be on the list.
To get to our sort of main point today, this move has Congress squirming. Tariffs are taxes, despite what some people may say, and Congress, not the president, is supposed to control the purse strings. So what's the Hill doing about it?
Well, they're not just squirming, they're also legislating. There is a flood of bills trying to yank the trade authority back from the executive branch. So let's start with H.R. 2712, which is the Reclaiming Congressional Trade Authority Act of 2025, sponsored by Representative Josh Gottenheimer. This one goes for the jugular. It repeals Section 232 entirely and severely restricts Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Any new tariffs would have to get the thumbs up from Congress after an ITC review and committee has a consultation on it and kind of gives a report on it.
So we're talking less shoot from the hip and more slow and steady.
Exactly, which when you're talking about the entire global economy is probably the pace you want to be doing. But unless it's a 120-day emergency, then the president can act first, but they still need to loop in Congress. And this is kind of the legislative equivalent of putting a child lock on the trade war button.
Excellent. That sounds like a very sensible idea. And there's more than that, though, right? I remember seeing something about the Trade Review Act. So what's that one?
Yeah, so that's a bipartisan approach. So Senate Bill 1272 and H.R. 2665, which were introduced by Senator Maria Cantwell and Representative Don Bacon. So it doesn't stop tariffs, and it does demand an economic impact report from the International Trade Commission before they're enacted. So both of these are kind of trying to say, hey, you can't really do stuff before we know what it could do beforehand. But it's kind of like telling the president, sure, you can push the red button, but let's take a little look-see at the manual first.
So checks and balances then with a side of math, which is nice. We love to see that. So what about the Stable Trade Policy Act I've heard so many murmurs about?
Yes. So that's Senate Bill 348, and it's from Senator Chris Coons. And the STABLE stands for Stopping Tariffs on Allies and Bolstering Legislative Exercise, because Congress loves a good acronym. This one says no tariffs on allies like NATO countries or other key partners without congressional sign-off. It also makes it harder to invoke national security, aka Section 232, just because you're annoyed with Canada's maple syrup dominance.
Oh, these Canadians and their maple syrup. It's a sticky situation indeed. And then, of course, we've got the curveball, H.R. 735, the United States Reciprocal Trade Act. So what's that?
Yes, this one is a Trump-style tariff policy in legislative form, and it is very different from the ones that we just talked about because it is essentially pro what Trump is doing right now. So this is originally from 2019, and it was resurrected this year by Representative Riley Moore, and it lets the president impose tariffs on a case-by-case basis if other countries have higher tariffs on U.S. goods. Proponents call it fair, and critics call it, how do you start a trade war in 5 seconds?
Yes. It is an interesting one, actually, but it could work. There's a certain logic there, right? Because you can say that in free trade, surely we should have a level playing field. But actually determining what the particular tariff rate can be quite complicated, and you can look at it in various ways. So, for example, between the US and the EU, which apparently is this terrible group of countries taking advantage of the US, and before the current trade war, I think it was something like the EU imposed an average tariff of 1.8%, and the US imposed an average tariff about 1.5%. So there was virtually no difference and virtually no tariffs at all. And yet, apparently, you can crunch the numbers to say that the EU has huge tariffs on goods from the US. So, very, very difficult to sort of do that fairly. What about our libertarian friends? I'm sure they've had something to say.
Yes, they did. So Senator Ron Paul's No Taxation Without Representation Act of 2025, or Senate Bill 1293, he wants tariffs treated like taxes because they are taxes. And that means that there's no new ones without Congress approving them via a joint resolution. It's bold, principled, and would make Hamilton proud.
Absolutely. And it may also stop there ever being any tariffs, because how likely are Congress to actually agree on this and pass a joint resolution? But it's not just about these big ticket power plays. So what are some of the more sort of niche bijou bills?
Yeah, so not everything is totally targeting what Trump is doing or this kind of executive power. There's other ways that tariffs impact our lives other than what Trump is doing right now. So we have a lot of different ones that are kind of interesting. Let's start with the End China's De Minimis Abuse Act, which tackles those tiny under $800 packages that sneak in tariff-free. Then we have the Stop Russian Market Manipulation Act, which bans imports of certain Russian minerals. And let's not forget the Pink Tariffs Study Act. Yep, that's the real name, which investigates whether tariffs disproportionately burden women due to the differences in consumer goods pricing.
Wow, well, tariffs, but let's make it feminist. I mean, there's room for all of us anyway, isn't there?
Yes, and there's also a bill in New Hampshire that directs their economic department to study the hypothetical 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Local government meets a trade war, if you will.
So that's oddly specific and very New England. So, Sarah, bottom line, what's all this tell us about Congress and tariffs in 2025?
So this tells us that this is about more than just economic policy. It is a power struggle, which again is something that we keep seeing as a theme under this Trump administration. The legislative branch is trying to claw back some control from a president who's made tariffs a central tool of their foreign policy decisions and kind of strategy. These bills reflect bipartisan concern over executive overreach, the economic pain of unpredictable trade actions, and the need for smarter evidence-based policy.
And let's not forget that we have Project 2025 in the background, which is seemingly everywhere these days. And just as a reminder, this is the whole conservative playbook to expand the executive power. And because of all of this, it's even more urgent for Congress to stake its claim in trade governance.
Exactly. It's kind of getting to a point where we are slipping down that slope. Who is going to put in a stake? But whether these bills can actually pass or not, the message is really clear. In the era of tariffs first, ask later, this is being seriously challenged.
Well, that's it for this week on Beyond the Bill Number. If you like the episode, rate, subscribe, or send us a carrier pigeon wrapped in a trade treaty. We'll take all feedback, unless, of course, it's 145% tariffs on compliments.
We'll be back next week with more legislative deep dives and fewer tax metaphors, maybe.
Well, one thing's for sure, we'll be looking beyond that bill number.